o'clock, and I'd love to welcome you all to the Grow Remote show. My name is Dónal. I'm from the community team on Grow Remote. And yeah, I want to welcome you all to episode 1 of the Grow Remote show. And this episode is all about remote jobs. What type of remote jobs are out there? And today we've asked Rachel Craig from EU Remote Jobs to join us. And we're going to get into a nice, casual and constructive conversation about remote work, about specific jobs that are out there, and just trying to get our heads around what exactly exists, because the landscape of remote jobs has changed so much over the last 2 years. So Rachel's going to help us understand that a little bit. And what I'm going to ask all of you to do is to add your questions in the chat. You should see Graham in the chat there. He is going to keep that flowing. But if you have any questions at all for Rachel or for Graham or myself, then you can pop them into the chat there. What I'd love you to do right now as you enter is just let us know your name. So send a message to everybody in the chat and just tell us where in the world you are. And maybe if you want to, tell us why you're joining today. Are you looking for a job? Are you working remotely yourself? Are you just interested in the progress and the development of the remote working world? Just let us know in the chat box, and we'd love to hear from you. All right, so thank you so much. We are going to go for about 45 minutes, so we should finish up at 3:45. That's the aim. And the structure is that we're just going to have a chat, myself and Rachel. And again, we're going to be taking questions from you guys, and we'll have a Q&A at the end for the last 10 minutes or so. So today I have Rachel Craig. She's the founder of EU Remote Jobs, which is a website and a blog advertising jobs with remote-friendly companies, and specifically companies providing remote work opportunities within European time zones as well. So that's through Europe, Middle East, and Africa, but also all across the world. And over the last 12 months, she's had over 120,000 job seekers visiting the website. Now that seems amazing, but actually I can well believe it, because of the world, the way where we are right now, things are shifting so much. And we know even from the community team here at Grow Remote that lots of people are getting in touch with us with questions about remote jobs. So how are you, Rachel?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Very, very well. Great to have you for our first guest. You're very brave joining us for the Grow Remote show as the #1 guest. But I have my first question, which isn't quite about remote jobs just yet. But I want you to tell me, what's your favorite thing about living in Barcelona?
Oh, it's probably hard to pick one, to be honest. But I mean, the more obvious one, relocating from Donegal, is probably the weather, to be honest.
Yeah, good one.
But no, I'm a cyclist, a road cyclist, so I like the mountains nearby to cycle quite regularly. That's probably one of the highlights.
And when did you make that transition? When did you move out to Spain?
I first came here in 2011, and I came and left quite a bit, and I'm settled here now. So quite a while.
Good stuff. And so my next question is about maybe remote work as a sort of idea. So in 2011, I suppose people knew what remote work is, but how would you define remote work now, where we are in a minute?
I'd say remote work is any job that you can perform that isn't, well, that's generally on a laptop and isn't restricted to a specific location, whether that's an office or a workshop of some kind. And then within that, there's probably quite a few different types of remote work, and that's, freelance, where someone has pretty flexible hours, and people might associate it with digital nomads or people who are traveling around the world. And then remote jobs, I would classify more as full-time remote jobs. They're similar to an office job, but obviously aren't restricted to that location.
Yeah, and so can you tell us, when did you start working remotely?
I think the end of 2016, early 2017. And yeah, that was probably why EU Remote Jobs came about. At the time, I had been introduced to the whole concept of remote work, and I traveled for a year in South America. And I think I met some people that were working remotely, and it was definitely something that was much more common in the US or in the Americas in general. So when I came back from that trip and I wanted a wee bit more flexibility to go home more often as well, um, I noticed that actually remote jobs in Europe were really hard to find, and most people weren't really aware of the concept.
So it was much more of a US idea, a lot more
Totally.
Americans working remotely, and probably I know that I've talked to people who were working remotely with Californian organizations and companies that were kind of based in Silicon Valley, but doing so online, like from the 1990s, early 1990s.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose people were doing it and they didn't really associate it as being anything particularly special. So yeah, it's interesting the evolution to where we are today.
Absolutely. And considering that evolution, where we have to ask ourselves, where is the remote jobs market right now? And like we have this massive amount of people going to your website, contacting us, trying to find remote work and trying to learn more about remote work, trying to access resources that is going to hopefully help them to find remote jobs and remote working opportunities, and remote work skills training as well. So I mean, how many remote jobs would there be available to Mandy and Monaghan, for example?
Well, it's hard to get an exact figure on this. As a lot of companies don't necessarily advertise. But if you use LinkedIn as a kind of to kind of get an estimate, in in December there was 55,000 remote jobs open across the European Economic Area. And when I looked this week, that number had jumped up to 83,000. So obviously, it's a substantial increase in the number of
Amazing. Yeah.
remote jobs that are around. Um, but yeah, like getting the exact figures is difficult, but it gives a good indication of what's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is amazing how that number has jumped up, and how we've all come to speak about remote work, and companies are really starting to bring it into their dialogue, and really starting to speak about it as something that is mainstream and is being normalized. And we've seen that with the remote alliance here, Grow Remote, where four organizations, Vodafone, eBay, ESB, and Liberty Insurance, have come together as a partnership to speak about remote working strategies, hybrid policies for their workplaces and for their people. And that's thousands and thousands of people all across Ireland. So things are changing.
Mm.
And what's your experience of people getting in touch with you and your website? And are the same questions coming up?
I mean, I would say probably a big one is entry level positions. This is kind of a quite a common topic. Or people saying that they've been applying for a long time and haven't been able to get a remote job. It is a little bit more competitive. Little bit is probably putting it mildly. It is more competitive. If you remove the geographic restriction of a job, then and it's open anywhere in the world, you're competing with people anywhere in the world. And the same applies across Europe and across Ireland. Obviously, for people coming in at entry level positions, it is difficult, I think, in a remote job, a remote environment. Um, but having spoke to quite a lot of remote companies already, I would say that there is something that goes in people's favor, and that is that in a remote working environment, things like communication skills are really valued. So if someone's worked in hospitality for 20 years and they have been able to collaborate with a team in a really busy, stressful environment and be organized and be on time, and you know these soft skills are really valued within a remote company. So I would say don't think that because you're breaking into a digital role for the first time that you're not going to get hired because you haven't got any work experience. you have got work experience, and the skills that you have from that experience is definitely applicable in these companies and extremely valuable. You know,
Absolutely.
just to say as well, you know, some of those companies actually say technical skills can be taught fairly easily, but soft skills can't. So if you have them, you're in a good position.
That's a brilliant point. And one to remember that as we go through our career, no matter what it is, we're constantly developing these soft skills
Mm-hmm.
through all the way through school and our further training. It's something that we're always working on. And as as with any job or any new thing that we learn, we have to pick up the sort of ground rules for any new job or workplace. But those soft skills, we're constantly working on them our whole life. And that's a really good point, because there's a lot of people who would be in touch with us through our community that maybe consider themselves digitally illiterate, in comparison, say, with digital natives, who are people who have grown up, like young people who have grown up completely on top of digital skills, using digital devices, and they just have an innate understanding of digital skills. But if you haven't grown up with those in your face every day, every hour of every day, you have to learn how to use these. And what you're saying is you can, and what these companies believe is you can learn those skills, but this transferable soft skills, how you relate to people, timekeeping, like these things that actually are really important in a professional context, they are what matter when people are looking for remote workers, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely emphasize that when you're applying to jobs. Even the likes of companies like Automatic. If you were to look at some of the people that work there, you can see that some of them have come from factories. Um, there's obviously really valuable skills that you're acquiring in those roles, and they are applicable to a remote work, and very valuable. So really emphasize that, I would say, when you're applying.
We got a question from Sarah. Thanks for all the questions, guys. Just keep them coming in the chat, and we've got one or two in the Q&A as well. So Sarah asks, just on this about skills, how do we prepare for a remote jobs interview? Is it the same as site jobs, on-site jobs, location-specific jobs? So I suppose people might be a bit worried about what an interview remotely looks like. Can you, I mean, obviously all these jobs that are on your website on EU remote jobs, they would be remote interviews, would they?
Yeah, everything is remote with those jobs. I mean, I would approach it in a similar way to a physical interview. Obviously, keep in mind things like, being able to make sure you're muted or your camera is on, showing that you can kind of um, manage the interview just in even the basic sense. But the interview should be fairly similar. And actually, what you'll find with remote jobs is it's the most important thing when you're applying is your actual application. What they'll be looking for when you are in an interview is things like, your cultural fit, uh, how you communicate, how you can um, demonstrate your value in the role that you're applying. So it's very similar, I would say, to a physical interview.
And we must remember that the application process, it might be an application form online, or it might be CV, cover letter. That's probably the same no matter if you're working in an office or working remotely. So that section of it would be probably very similar no matter what the job is you're going for. But when it comes to interview, rather than walking in with your suit or your whatever you're dressed up to impress, you're actually online. So you need to have a little bit of confidence on a call like this, maybe where you're speaking and answering questions, maybe with a panel of 3 or 4 different screens, and just knowing how to behave online. And this is for people who wouldn't be used to working digitally, but have the skills and they have the qualifications. So it's important to remember that. And I think your point about cultural fit is really important. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about that for people who don't know? People talk, all these companies talking about culture and cultural fit and our key cultural priorities. What does a cultural fit actually mean in practice?
I mean, I would say it's probably demonstrating your values are aligned to the companies. So if they're looking for someone that is, passionate about remote work, for example, and you're going into a fully remote company, say the likes of GitLab, they're really creating the blueprint for remote companies. I think that kind of showing that you're aligned to those values is really important. And that is something you'll see quite often within even just job descriptions within a remote company. It tends to be companies that are implementing this model tend to really be 100% behind it, especially if it's a fully remote model. So of course they want to take people on that want to embrace that and really want to collaborate effectively with the remote team, so that they don't need to be in a physical space with the rest of their team.
Because there is a difference, isn't there, maybe in these culture-driven companies that prioritize remote, there is a difference in approach to managing and leading a team when everybody is distributed across the world or across Ireland or across a county. And that it is important to remember that it's a lot about people, and you do want to get on with the people, and they want to see and know who you are when you're in your interview or in your application. We're getting some other questions. Thanks again, guys. Keep the questions coming in the chat and in the Q&A section. We've got a question from anonymous attendee. Thanks for coming, anonymous attendee. We have a question specifically about what industries are hiring more remotely. And I know that you would see on EU remote jobs a lot of the same types of work coming up, but it's across lots of different industries as well, and different companies doing lots of different types of things. So a follow-up to that question is, I notice most jobs are around tech. So are there any non-tech jobs? So maybe tell us, Rachel, what types in general, what types of industries are there, and which of those are non-tech?
So I would say, like, there is a huge misconception that you need to be a developer, for example, to get a remote job. There are remote jobs literally across the spectrum. So there was a counsellor position listed on EU remote jobs the other day. I seen an actuarial position. This is something that's normally within a very rigid structure, that it would be very office based. So like, you'll find that basically anything you can do on a computer can be done remotely. And because of the pandemic, obviously all companies across all industries are now implementing remote if they find that it's been beneficial to their team. So there is no specific industries, I would say, but things like health tech is a big one at the minute. And then also, things like companies that are facilitating remote work obviously is massive at the moment. The likes of Hopin, companies that are facilitating video or async communication or whatever it might be. Team retreats, there's a big benefits for remote teams. There's so many things coming up. So, it is good to think about too, maybe your own interests, and looking at companies that are working within those your interests. And then, if they're hiring remotely, that's a good company for you to approach as well if you're looking for a remote job, because you might have experience in their industry and they'll value that.
Yeah, that's great. And it's worth remembering that a lot of these industries, a lot of these roles are popping up because of remote work. So those few companies and jobs that you mentioned, they're organizations that are expanding because of the demand, where everybody had to go online. Well, in industries which could work online, they went online in mid 2020. So all these companies, I mean, Zoom is one example, it just exploded. And there are all these other softwares and apps and ways of working that had to be built, literally built and sustained in order to to make all this possible. So there are jobs and industries that probably exist that didn't exist a year and a half ago or so. And that shows us actually that there's probably a big turning point coming. We're going to round the bend at some point and see that there's a whole new industry opening up, and loads more jobs because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the companies that are service in the industry are definitely going to be hiring remotely, or they're highly likely going to be hiring remotely. So, they're definitely ones to watch as well if it's something that you're interested in.
And it's a good point about uh, the need for venues, and when people do come together for retreats and other types of team building activities, they still will happen, but there's going to be an increased demand for that type of work, probably in certain places. So bringing teams together, doing specific types of weekends or whatever. So that's just one example. There's another few questions here. From Sarah, is there any specific website for research jobs? So remote research jobs, which is an interesting one. So research fellow, researcher. Traditionally, I suppose they would have been associated with universities or research institutes. Have you seen that those types of academic or research roles popping up, or maybe has that industry changed that much?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think all industries are changing. The only thing about an industry like that, it's probably going to be restricted to specific countries. So if it's a university in Ireland, they're likely going to keep it within Ireland. So when it's that niche, I think definitely looking locally. But I would say absolutely they would be remote as well if it's possible. If there's no physical restrictions on the job, there's no need. I personally haven't come across that. So I can't help you that with that one, but I'd say it would absolutely exist.
And that's a really big question, actually, that a lot of our people have, Rachel. If I'm living in Ireland and there's a job that comes up, say, on remote jobs based in Belgium, with headquarters in Belgium, can I work for that organization living in Kerry? Is it possible for me to do that, or do I have to be living within the jurisdiction?
This is a very interesting topic. So I really try to be as transparent as possible on EU remote jobs about where the actual jobs are open in which countries. I have seen many more companies actually specifying this in the job descriptions, but many of them say open to European time zones or open across Europe. Um, if you're unsure, I would try and reach out to the company. It could be that they don't actually have the answer themselves. And especially I think as the industry is changing, or as this environment is changing so quickly, I think companies are kind of dealing with it on a case by case basis. So if you see a company in Belgium that's hiring across Europe, apply. If you're not sure, you can ask them, or if the application is quite rigorous, try and contact them first. Um, it could be that they will look at it based on where the candidates are based in the end. So, for example, if they narrow it down to 3 people, and one of them lives in Ireland, and one of them lives in the UK, and one is in Spain, they're going to see what the options are to actually hire them compliantly. But it is difficult, I understand, from a job seeker's point of view, because I'm looking at these jobs all the time and I can see that it isn't clear with the companies, but it is definitely because the companies don't fully know what to do themselves. So, we'll see that changing most definitely. I mean, this is obviously quite a big topic at the moment. There's a lot of companies that are being developed to kind of solve this problem. But they're not the right solution in all cases for the companies, and I think it has to be looked at on a case by case basis. So it's a little bit frustrating for job seekers, but I would say if it says open to Europe, definitely apply if you're in Ireland. And if you can ask the hiring manager, even better.
That's great advice. And I'm really glad that you said that these companies often don't know themselves, because we know this from uh, our employers' work at Grow Remote, where we're speaking to employers constantly about this very thing, whether it's remote strategy for responding to the government national remote work strategy, or hybrid policy for companies determining who works in the office and when, or whether it's actually recruitment policy about how do we recruit someone who's outside of our jurisdiction, or even how do we recruit someone within our jurisdiction? What are the benefits? What are the rules around this? This is all being worked out. And that's why it's such an exciting time, if confusing and frustrating for a lot of people, but very exciting to be speaking about this, because we are on the first wave, if you like. We're trying to work this out and make sense of it. And people like yourself with your website, you are right on the cusp of this massive cultural shift.
Absolutely. And I would say, as well, Ireland is in a unique position in terms of the remote jobs that are open in Ireland or open in Europe. Um, I think that it's quite an attractive country to target for remote workers. I actually spoke to a company in Norway a few months back, and they said they were specifically looking for people in Ireland. It was the level of skills and then actually navigating the local legislation they found much easier in Ireland compared to, I mean, somewhere like maybe Spain or Italy, for example, might be a wee bit more tricky. So I think that definitely don't think because you're not in certain countries you can't apply. I think it's an attractive country to a lot of companies.
Brilliant. And just want to say thanks again and hello to anybody new who's joined us. We will be sharing all these websites. Remote Jobs is what we're focusing on today with Rachel Craig. And there are other websites which we will share with you if you want to continue your job search and try and find a remote job that suits your lifestyle. So we will be posting those in the chat. We've got another anonymous attendee. Thank you for joining. A question about shifting careers. So I'm shifting careers and don't have experience. Do companies usually require you to have remote experience? Very good question. So do I need to have worked remotely in order to be eligible to get these remote jobs?
No, absolutely not. And people need to come in somewhere. I think that um if you've got experience in an office environment doing what a role that you're applying for, then you're not in any disadvantage just to be switching to remote. I think you're going to have to highlight maybe some of your own traits that you can kind of work well in a remote environment. But because we've all just gone through lockdowns globally and we've all been working remotely, if we're applying for these kinds of jobs, absolutely, you're not at any disadvantage. You just highlight maybe some of the ways that you were working effectively during the pandemic. I mean, there's many downsides to the pandemic, obviously, but then I think now people, most people do have a little bit of experience working remotely. So they were kind of forced into their remote, their first remote job. And I know that maybe might not have been an amazing experience for everyone just because of the speed that it happened and how companies themselves were dealing with that. People were kind of learning as they went, and a lot of people didn't even have kind of sufficient space to be working and things like that. So it's not really a true representation of what a remote job would be. And I think it's important to know that as well, that hopefully people haven't been put off.
Exactly. And that's a very valid point that lots of people in our community have been talking about. What if your company suddenly went online in March 2020 and you've been working in your bedroom, as I was? That doesn't mean that you were necessarily, you had a remote job. That just meant that you were doing what you would have done in the office, well, trying to online with your computer or whatever you had. So it's important to remember that just because you maybe have experience of working digitally or working online is not the same as what a remote work, what a remote job, a remote employment would entail. I mean, what are some of the biggest differences? Maybe one of some of the, like for really remote first, true remote jobs, what types of things are maybe new for someone who hasn't done it before, Rachel?
I mean, sorry, I'm actually just going to move my chair up a little bit because the sun is starting to shine.
Yeah, the Catalan sunshine's getting in your face.
I didn't position myself well before the call. So I would say the big difference is all remote companies are structured in a way that facilitates people to be comfortable and productive when they're working. So, for example, if you've got a team that's spread across Ireland and San Francisco, and the people in Ireland have their whole workday done by the time the people in San Francisco start their day. An all remote company is going to have specific processes in place for how people can effectively communicate together. There's going to be much more boundaries in terms of when a manager can get in touch with their employees. They're not going to be thinking, but you work remotely, so I can message you at 9 o'clock at night if I want, and I expect a immediate response. Processes are put together, and normally the one of the reasons that a company is fully remote is because they put much more emphasis on the value of your work rather than when you're working, or being in your chair from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. So I think they really value well-being within the team, and their benefits are designed to facilitate that as well. So they'll tend to offer a lot more time off, like paid holidays. And then they'll pay. I think well-being benefits has been a big thing since the pandemic, where people are really looking at how they can support their team, their mental health. I mean, it's obviously been uh, highlighted a lot during the pandemic. So the real emphasis in an all remote company is that the team is happy and productive, and there isn't the same culture of you need to work at a specific time and finish at a specific time, and because you're paid 8 hours, it is really more emphasized on the output, I would say.
Yeah, and that's in contrast to maybe a culture of presenteeism where you have to
Mhm.
be physically sitting at your desk. But there might be, lots of people listening to this saying, Rachel, you can't be serious. I mean, how can all these companies suddenly have the priority of their workers in mind and talking about wellness and time off and all these things? Is that really what's happening? Is that really what's coming down the line?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's some companies that give you, there's one in Time Wheeler actually. They give 50 days paid holidays to the team. There's a real emphasis on switching off and people getting a break from work so that they can recharge and come back and actually perform better because they're well rested. There's no, the companies and people that are kind of designing the processes within these companies are moving away from what would traditionally have happened in an office in terms of how people work. And they are creating processes all the time to improve that. And that's through the benefits, that's through how they communicate. Someone sends you a message and you're in the middle of working on something. Does a person respond immediately? Or what's the emphasis? Do you focus on the work that you're doing and come back to the person when you've finished? And I think remote companies are really clearly defining those kinds of processes, and for that it tends to be overall things emphasize more to well-being and productivity.
Yeah, it's going to be a big conversation going forward over the next year or so, how that ideal and actually that reality in a lot of companies translates across the mainstream. Because as I mentioned with the Remote Alliance, this is just the start of the talking point, really. I want to ask one more question, and then I'm going to go back to the questions, the Q&A, open it up for the next 10 minutes. If you have any more questions, pop them in. I've got another one from an anonymous attendee, but before I come to that, it's kind of following on from what we said earlier. Job seekers can be at many different stages in their career. So is remote work something for job seekers who already have plenty of work experience, or maybe does it favor these digital natives who actually have the skills that maybe they're coming out of college or they're leaving school and they're looking for these types of jobs? Do you think there's a bias on either side?
I think it depends on the person. It will depend on, I don't necessarily, and actually, to be totally honest, I don't see that many remote companies, unfortunately, hiring people without any prior experience. There's definitely some work that needs to be done in that area. So people coming straight out of university or coming out of any type of studies that they've just done and maybe don't have prior experience. I would love to see, more companies hiring people that are entry level. It will happen. It is happening. It's changing. And again, post pandemic, you'll see that more. But there's definitely a gap there for the companies taking people in at that level. I would say definitely people that have work experience in any other area and they can demonstrate their soft skills. Companies are really going to favor that. Obviously they'll tend to want people to couple it with a little bit of digital experience in the position that they're advertising or they're trying to fill. But if I would say, don't be put off if you see a company that's advertising and they're asking for 3 years experience and you have one, then don't apply anyway. Apply anyway and show what you can do, maybe through your portfolio or whatever, depending on the position. Try and be creative probably to get your application to stand out. But definitely don't be deterred and just sell the skills that you have and apply it to a remote environment and how you will fit in.
Yeah, good point. And it's probably more to do with the personality of the person than actually their experience or their skills, often because they can develop those. But it's also worth mentioning that it opens it up for people who are coming from different industries or certain backgrounds, and we know that people with disabilities are able to access certain types of jobs which would never have been possible in a location specific industry. So I'm gonna go over to the question. We've got hello anonymous attendee. Do we still have you there, Rachel?
You do, yeah.
Good stuff. Nice one. Do you still get companies posting temporary remote positions in your jobs board? So these are non-full-time employment. And what's your opinion about it? Actually, that's an interesting question. And then there's also another question in the chat about part-time work. So temporary and part-time, do you see that as well?
So we don't publish any jobs that are only temporarily remote. They all have to be permanently remote. So we just, everything is fully remote on the website. I would say for jobs, if you're finding it somewhere else, that if it says temporarily remote, and you don't want to, you're looking for a fully remote job, ask them. I think now is a time where things are really changing. Companies are still evaluating how they're going to move forward in terms of offering their team permanent remote roles, or whether they're asking them to come back to the office. We've all seen the news every day on this. But definitely ask. If you're not sure, ask them, show them the qualifications that you have and why you think that you would be good for the job, and ask them if you can do it permanently remote. I think that it's good to keep in mind that when someone writes a job description, what they're looking for is the best person for the job. So, you know, especially now, when people have been working remotely, companies have been functioning and functioning very well, most of them, uh, with their team working remotely. Don't be afraid to ask for things like that. I've heard of people, you know, being asked to come back to the office and then negotiating a fully remote role. So it is happening, and companies are more interested in having the right person for the job. In terms of part-time jobs, we generally are focused on full-time permanent remote positions. Occasionally we do list some part-time positions because of course people are interested, for maybe they have a family and this makes sense for them. Um, and they exist, there's lots of them around, but then I think you're kind of going into the area of gig work or freelance positions then. In terms of companies hiring for employees as part-time, they're kind of few and far between.
All right, good stuff.
Mm.
And we got another quick question here. What about salaries? Thank you, anonymous attendee. Do you notice if remote jobs are paid more or less? Very interesting question. Do you see a trend with a difference in salary based on remote or location specific?
Yeah, it probably depends on where the company is based, and where you're based. So if you're in San Francisco and you see a German company hiring, probably that salary is going to be really low for you because you're used to San Francisco salaries. But in general, remote roles are much better paid. Um, in general, I think that again, this is the company emphasizing the right things because they want to um, attract the best people. You know, often that's why they're hiring remotely, is because they want the best people in the team and they're willing to pay for it and give them the benefits that will keep them.
Yeah, good point. And we will see lots of development and evolution of this. I mean, we're only starting to really talk about it now this last year. So it's on the tip of the tongues of lots of companies, lots of sort of journalists and people really digging into this right now. So I think if we had this conversation 12 months from now, our answers would probably be quite different. And I'm sure the work of EU remote jobs will grow and evolve and change quite a lot over that time, considering the jump from 55,000 to 85,000. Is that what you said? That's
83.
unbelievable in just 10 months. Okay, last question. What's the weirdest or most unusual remote role submitted to EU remote jobs so far?
I don't know. I've had a few jobs that I've had to decline that I haven't published. I'll probably keep that off this video. I don't know. I think the weirdest uh, is probably, I mean, I think the actuarial one was one that I've seen recently, and I just was really surprised because this is quite a rigid industry normally. You know, it's quite financial, quite legal. So that's off the top of my head. I'm sure when I'll get off the call, I'll remember a stranger one.
Yeah, good stuff. We'll keep in touch, of course, and I want to thank everybody who's attended today and everybody who's watching back. Just to remind you, euremotejobs.com, and we've got also we're going to put into the chat a few other websites that people can have a look at as well that might help. And of course, if you're interested in finding out more resources just for job seekers about the remote working world, about the developments and evolution of the field, then you can always get in touch with us. You're probably watching this on one of our channels right now, so just reach out to any of us on the community team. And thank you very, very much for joining us today. Rachel, it was an absolute pleasure. Episode 1 done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff. So thanks again. Our next episode of the Grow Remote Show will be at the same time. So that's 3 p.m. Irish time. So work that out wherever you are. On Thursday, the 11th of November, when we'll be chatting to Gary Mullen of fully remote e-commerce multinational Shopify. And we didn't even get into talking about some of the big companies that are hiring. But if people go to EURemoteJobs.com right now, you can have a look through them all. There are loads there. And thanks again to the Grow Remote team behind the show, specifically Graham and June, who are in the back moving all the cogs right now. And once again, thank you so much, Rachel. Appreciate you taking your time out of the beautiful Barcelona evening. So it's great to have you.
Thank you.
So we'll see you all for the next episode. And until next time, look after yourself. Thanks, guys.